Dr. António Vitorino, who is currently the Director General of the International Organization for Migration. I will just give you some highlights from his CV because it would be taking too much precious time from our lecture today. To let you know a bit about Dr. António Vitorino, who is a very well-known Portuguese politician, but also at the same time a law professor. He was also European Commissioner for Justice and Home Affairs. He was Deputy Minister in Portugal and Minister of Defense. And he had also long experience both as a member of the government of Macau, a member of the Portuguese Parliament, and he was also a judge at the Portuguese Constitutional Court. He also taught for quite some time constitutional law, international human rights law, at the faculty where I graduated from. And actually, on a personal note, let me say how much pleased I am to see Dr. Vitorino today. He was my professor on the subject of fundamental rights at the last year of university. And he was also actually my boss when I was a legal advisor in the Ministry of Defense and he was Minister for Defense. So, Dr. António Vitorino, it's really a pleasure to welcome you today to speak to the participants of the eAcademy. We will hear with great interest to your presentation, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. I'm trying to look for you. There you are. The floor is all yours, and thank you so much for having accepted our invitation to be with us at the Academy today.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, in spite of the fact that I'm in Geneva, and for me it's still morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much to the CIL eAcademy and particularly to Patricia Galvão-Teles. It's a pleasure to see you again, though in a remote way. Thank you so much for the invitation. I propose to you to have a brief overview of a stock-taking exercise of the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration 2 years after Marrakech. But maybe it is interesting for you also to put the Global Compact into perspective. There is one key year that I would like to call your attention upon. It is 2015. There was a major migration crisis in Europe, so-called migration crisis, the arrivals of the migrants and refugees from Syria to European shores. And following that event, there was a trend in the United Nations about the need to include migration in the international agenda. And there are two milestones for that purpose. First, for the first time in the history of the United Nations, there is a document that explicitly mentions migration as a key driver for development. I'm talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm talking about Agenda 2030. And probably if you compare Agenda 2030 with the so-called Millennium Goals of the year 2000, the most striking difference is precisely that in the SDGs, there is for the first time the recognition that migration can be a tool for development if it is appropriately managed, which means safely, orderly, and regularly managed. But the second milestone of 2015 is the New York Declaration on the protection of migrants and refugees. And the New York Declaration was on the basis of the parallel exercises of the adoption of the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration and of the Global Compact on Refugees. And both of them came to an end in 2018, at the end of 2018, being adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. But there were two very different streams. The GCM was a purely intergovernmental process. It was a negotiation among member states facilitated by two countries, Mexico and Switzerland. On the other side, the Global Compact on Refugees was an exercise driven by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and it came to an end also at the same time at the end of 2018. And probably for you that study these issues, it will be interesting to compare the two documents. Because in fact, I believe they are complementary in the sense that they have different scopes, but they are very different in nature. Because the Global Compact on Migration, it's a platform of political cooperation. It's a non-binding instrument. It is a state-led exercise. It is volunteer in the sense that the countries that want to exceed, they exceed. The ones who want to stay out will not exceed to the Global Compact. And as we are going to see, that has happened. And above all, it includes what we call, in our terrible jargon, a 360-degree view. Because it is a political platform of cooperation of countries that have very different backgrounds and very different positions in the migratory journey. Countries of origin, countries of transit, and countries of destination, not just the whole of government approach, but also a whole of government society. And this 360-degree view is something quite original in the sense that in spite of the fact that each country has a different perspective on migration, and there are lots of different perspectives, I can guarantee you, in practical terms, the attempt, the challenge is, can those countries with different perspectives and in different positions in relation to the migratory journey come together and work together in order to improve the management of migration. On the opposite side, I would say that the Global Compact on Refugees, it's above all an instrument of internal organization of the sharing the responsibility of protection to migrants per reference to a very enshrined and long, deep, integrated legal system, the Geneva Convention of 1951, and all the jurisprudence that was built around it. So the nature of the two compacts is rather different, and that's why their evolution also is different. But there is a second reason, which is from 2015 to 2018, and now to 2020, one has to recognize that migration, and to a certain extent, refugees, asylum regulations, have become highly controversial, have become issues very divisive in quite a number of societies. And don't think I'm just speaking about the societies of countries of destination. It's also a divisive issue in countries of origin and in countries of transit. In some cases, even it is considered a toxic subject and is, let's say, very much prone to manipulation, to distortion, and to the misuse of migrants as a scapegoat of quite a large number of social problems in our societies. And to a certain extent, the outcome of the Global Compact reflects also this divisive environment. Key countries like the United States, like Australia, or like some countries of the European Union, such as Italy, or Austria, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and even one of the countries that was a co-facilitator, Switzerland, did not subscribe to the Global Compact. The reasons are different, I must say. Not all of them have the same reasons, but maybe it would be interesting to look a little bit to the positions that have been expressed at that time in 2018, even from the legal point of view. I know that you are fortunate to have today also a lecture by Professor Vincent Chataille, and he is probably the best person to introduce you to the legal controversies around the Global Compact. Some of the countries that rejected the Global Compact on the basis of a legal argument, because others have done it only on a pure political basis, but with some legal sustainability, have invoked what they consider the fear of having the Global Compact as a soft law instrument, just a pure political cooperation statement, as the source of customary international law, and that's why they have shown reluctance in acceding to the Global Compact, because they did not want to have an instrument that could become in the future a source of a more binding and legally constraining instrument. So what has happened in these 2 years after 2018? I will try to sum up very briefly in 2 different streams. On one side, from the procedural and institutional point of view, what is noticeable is that the Global Compact, in spite of being a non-binding instrument, has been used by quite a number of member states as a reference document, as a guideline for the implementation of their own national migration policies. Both national migration policies as such, or in some cases even specific national implementation plans for the Global Compact. Let's be honest, this has happened more frequently in the Global South than in the Global North. Probably Portugal, which is my nationality, and Patricia also, is one of the few examples of a northern country that has adopted a national plan for the implementation of the Global Compact. But on the institutional side, in the United Nations, the Global Compact created a number of layers that are extremely relevant for the future. They are in their infancy, of course, they have started working, but they have a common target, which is to have a joint position of the UN system when it comes to migration, bringing the different UN agencies together to have one voice of the UN on migration issues, as the Secretary General Guterres has expressed it. And that's why there has been it was set up the UN Migration Network, United Nations Migration Network, that is coordinated by the organization that I have the privilege of leading, the International Organization for Migration, that brings together 38 agencies, entities and bodies of the United Nations which mandate as connections with migration. And on the basis of the UN Migration Network, according to the Global Compact, there will be a knowledge platform and a connection hub to instruments to improve and foster cooperation among member states, and also a multi-partner trust fund that started already funding the first projects in the field of joint action among the governments and UN agencies in the implementation of the Global Compact. Besides that, there has been a dynamic, which is not very visible in the public arena, of creating coordination mechanisms at national level and regional level, particularly in some regions in the world. For instance, in your region, I mean, the region of Asia Pacific, ESCAP, the Economic Commission of UN, has been particularly active in setting up a regional coordination mechanism for migration and implementing it also at national level. My second remark is about, is it the Global Compact being a game changer in migration? No, not really. Documents can be helpful, can make a difference, but it will be probably too daring to ask a document like the Global Compact to be a game changer. But there have been some changes that are substantially interesting in the current framework. And I will build those examples on the pandemic itself. So as you can imagine, nobody anticipated this pandemic. The pandemic, the COVID-19, came as a surprise without any significant precedent. And for an activity that is based on human mobility, like migration, for instance, well, the truth is that for the first time in history, the world came to a stop. That's the reality. That's the reality. In more than 200 countries and territories, restrictions, travel restrictions, closure of the borders, lockdowns have been adopted. 94,000 restrictions of the movement have been adopted worldwide. So in this unpredicted environment, how did the GCM, the Global Compact, test in effective terms? I will give you 3 examples. The first one is one which is very sensitive and was one of the most difficult points of the negotiation in the Global Compact, is the principle of access of migrants to social services. This was so controversial in the Global Compact that the formulation in the Global Compact is with a lot of caveats. What was the key issue underlying the discussion? Well, it was that quite a large number of countries of destination did not want to accept that being, for instance, access to health being a human right. They did not want the compact to recognize the right to access to health care to irregular migrants. So the formulation, if you see the corresponding objective of the Global Compact, is very careful and very cautious. But in practice, and if you recall also in the General Assembly of September 2019, the member states of the United Nations have adopted a declaration on universal health coverage. The last point to be agreed in that universal health coverage declaration was precisely the point referring to migrants. Could migrants have a human right of access to health care? Well, the reality is that the pandemic has shown that if we want to be effective in the fight against the virus, we need to make sure that all migrants, all that are present in the territory of a country, need to have access to health care. I will be very cautious on this point because I know that there are lots of assistance coming from Singapore, but Singapore knows very well what I'm talking about. Because, as you know, you have had a very successful fight against the virus in the beginning of the pandemic, and then suddenly you knew a setback because of an outbreak in the migrant dormitories in Singapore. So as the Secretary General of the United Nations has made very clear, no one is safe until everybody is safe. And so the principle of access to health care has been tested by the pandemic, and I think that the demonstration is there in concrete terms that it is absolutely necessary to guarantee that all migrants, irrespective of their legal status, I underline, irrespective of their legal status, have access to health care, to screening, to prevention, and to treatment of health care in the framework, in the environment of the pandemic. But there will be, in the short term, a new test case, which will be vaccination. We are all waiting for a vaccine, aren't we? We all recognize that being effective in the fight against the pandemic, we need to have a vaccine. Well, the reality is that the principle that I have mentioned about access to health care is equally valid when it comes to access to the vaccine. And including the migrants and refugees, asylum seekers in the vaccination plans at national level will be a key part if we want to be effective in the fight against the pandemic. The pandemic has also shown 2 other areas where I think it is we need to speak about for the future. The first one is that a number of countries have decided to adopt measures of regularization and of extended visa authorizations and resident permits to migrants in order to prevent them to fall into an irregular situation, a irregular administrative situation due to the lockdown of the official services. Countries like Portugal or Italy, so countries of destination, more clearly, others more discreetly. I will not say which countries did it very discreetly, we're afraid of their own public opinion, but anyway, quite a large number of countries have decided to adopt extraordinary measures of regularization, of extending permits of stay and authorizations of residence for migrants in order to avoid that the lockdowns of the official services would make them fall into irregularity. And linked to this, for the first time in the international debate, there is a new concept of essential workers. What does it mean, essential workers? Well, during the pandemic and above all during the lockdowns, it was clear that the migrants played a crucial role. Okay, the most common example is health system. You know that in a number of countries like the one where I am, Switzerland, but also in the UK or in the United States, more than 30 to 40% of the health personnel are migrants or of migrant origin. So migrants were in the first line of fight of the combat against the virus, and even some countries have tried to recruit qualified medical and nurses staff worldwide in the fight against the pandemic. But I'm not just talking about the health system. I'm also talking about the functioning of the society. As I always say, while we were in our houses locked down and only allowed to go to the pharmacy or to the supermarket, indeed someone had to be there in the supermarket or in the retail sector, in the distribution sector, in the public transportation sector, also in the seasonal agricultural works to guarantee that the food would arrive to our homes where we were cautiously being kept in order to avoid the spread of the virus. And to a large extent, those jobs were done by migrants that have been considered essential workers. I have even a few examples of countries that have adopted specific waivers for seasonal workers. For instance, Germany organized charter flights from Romania and Moldova to guarantee that the agricultural workers of those countries would come to Germany and save the asparagus crop for the entire year. This has also happened in the United States, where seasonal workers from Mexico had a special waiver to travel during the lockdown, during the peak of the pandemic, to guarantee the functioning of the meat processing plants or to some specific agricultural works. Well, Patricia, let me just conclude with a last reference to the other side of the moon. Okay, don't think that I'm giving you a picture where the global compact made a difference only in a positive way. These are a few examples I would like to give you of positive evolutions, but we also have the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin, indeed, is that we have currently in the world almost 3 million migrants who are stranded because of the closure of the borders, because of the travel restrictions, and because of the lockdowns in very difficult humanitarian conditions. And 1.2 million of those stranded migrants who wish to return home, but who are blocked, who are stuck in the way because of the closure of the borders, because of the travel restrictions, 1.2 million are in Asia Pacific, and mainly in the continental part of the Asia Pacific region. Another example, which is disturbing, is, for instance, the situation in the Gulf. We have a flow of people that leave the Horn of Africa in direction to the Gulf countries. But at the same time, we have hundreds of thousands of people in the Gulf countries, mainly from India, from Nepal, from Bangladesh, from the Philippines, who are there stuck because they have lost their livelihood, they have lost their jobs, and they are unable to go back home because they cannot afford the payment of the journey back to the countries of origin. Or if you look to Latin America, the pandemic has generated a movement of Venezuelans, and you know there are 5.5 million Venezuelans displaced in the countries of the region, whether they are migrants or refugees in the region, And those migrants and refugees have lost also their jobs. Most of them work in the informal economy. With the lockdowns, they have lost their jobs. Quite a large number decided to come back to Venezuela, 100,000 in our estimation. But at the same time, due to the very difficult humanitarian situation in Venezuela, what we see is again an uptaking of Venezuelans departing from Venezuela. So you have a two-way street. Several are coming back, but at the same time, quite a large number is again leaving Venezuela. And these are issues that are not clearly addressed neither by the Global Compact on Migration and by the Global Compact on Refugees. And I will conclude with the 3 examples. First, mixed flows. Today, people on the move are what we, in our jargon, call mixed flows, because you have to gather people on the move for different reasons. You have refugees, you have asylum seekers, you have economic migrants. When they move, you don't distinguish them by the color of their eyes. But in practical terms, they have different legal stages and they are entitled to different responses from the countries of destination. And the issue of mixed flows is something that is there in between the two compacts. And in practical terms, IOM and UNHCR are, in most of the cases, together dealing with mixed flows. That's what happens, for instance, in Venezuela, where people out of the 5.5 million, there is almost 2 million who might be entitled to the status of refugees, but the other 3.5 are migrants that have moved because of the economic situation of Venezuela. And neither one or the other of the compacts specifically addresses the issue of how to deal with mixed flows and what are the responsibilities of the different stakeholders in relation to mixed flows. Second example of a gray zone in between the two compacts, it's the internally displaced people. There are 50 million internally displaced people. Who are these IDPs? They are people who have left their regions of origin. They have moved to another region in the same country. So they did not cross an international border. They are not refugees in the sense that they are not entitled to the international protection because they are inside their own country, but they are not international migrants because they have not crossed the border, but they are now 50 million people. So if you have worldwide 30 million refugees, according to the criteria of the Geneva Convention, you have 50 million internally displaced people. And those people need humanitarian assistance, need alternative solutions to rebuild their lives, find alternative livelihoods. And this is particularly relevant in Africa, where the large movement of urbanization in Africa, African cities are the fastest cities in the world, but the movement of urbanization in Africa is largely due to internally displaced. And last but not least, last example, and I conclude here, is the impact of climate change in people's mobility. Quite a large number of people that are internally displaced, they move because of climate change, because of environmental degradation, because they have lost access to resources like water, or because the arable lands have become useless due to salinization, for instance. So there is a clear dimension of mobility. I would say migration, but I do not want to enter into a conflict with our friends from UNHCR. I'm not very fond of the idea of climate refugees, it's true. And I prefer to say climate displaced people. Then we can discuss what is the kind of legal status that is most appropriate to deal with this situation. Because some of the people displaced due to climate change, they do it internally in the same country, but some are displaced and they move from one country to the other. And the environmental degradation is not just a country, it does not stop at the borders of a country. it's a regional process. And if you look to the Sahel, for instance, you will see the major impacts of climate change and environmental degradation in the mobility in all the countries of the Lake Chad basin and the northern and western Sahel, with consequences then in terms of migratory movements. We have a rise of more than 500% of arrivals of West Africans and Central African people in the Canary Islands, going by boat in one of the most dangerous maritime trips, because the Atlantic is not as mild as the Mediterranean, and we know how many people die in the Mediterranean, unfortunately, and the figures of deaths in the Atlantic are even more staggering. So there you have, Patricia. So it's an overview. It's a very brief overview, but I will be very much willing to answer all questions that you might have. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. António Vitorino. It's an overview, but it was very complete, at the same time very concrete and very frank, I have to say. You really try to illustrate the challenges of the Global Compact and the political acceptance or not after the Global Compact was negotiated, but also in the current context of the pandemic, which was totally unexpected when the Global Compact was being prepared. And indeed, I think you've highlighted the positive aspects of the work done by migrants in the current context of the pandemic, but also the difficulties. And at the end, you have concluded in identifying the gray zones that are still more legally to be discussed. And I think there will be certainly questions in that regard. And in particular, I think there's some interest in our participants, because we've had that discussion also in other modules on the question of climate change induced displacement, which is an area that the IOM is following very closely. So I really wanted to thank you for this brilliant overview. And I wanted to ask the participants to feel free, knowing you, I know you like to take questions and to engage with students. So I would really encourage the participants to ask either live questions or through the chat, and really take advantage of the privilege of having the Director General of IOM in your living room and being able to ask him direct questions. So the floor is open for questions. I'm trying to, I don't see the raised hand, so I will ask for Aileen to help me, or feel free to.
I haven't seen any raised hands either, but if there are no questions at the moment, maybe I can kickstart things off with a question.
Yes, go ahead, and then we have one in the chat that I've just seen. So go ahead, Aileen, ask your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Antonio. That was really inspiring. So I have actually two questions. In terms of identifying the gray zones, you pointed out the impacts of climate change. And actually, many of the scholars have welcomed both of the compacts because they make references to the impacts of environmental changes. So how do you actually interpret these references? Do you see them as not strong enough to come up with proper solutions in terms of providing protection for such people? And the second question would be, in lieu of all the negative as well as the positive impacts you've identified, how do you see the International Migration Review Forum, which will take place in 2022 for the first time, to shape things and to improve the discourse on the compacts? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions. On the first element, well, now you take my answer with the caveats, okay? I think that the Global Compact of Migration is a little bit more explicit on climate change and displacement than the Global Compact on Refugees. But don't rush to the idea that I'm saying I'm taking any consequence of that. I'm just saying that to a certain extent, this is due to the different nature of the two compacts, as I have explained in the beginning of my presentation. But IOM, on the basis of the Global Compact, builds its strategy on climate change displacement, definitely. And we think that there is a need to look to the impacts of climate change in the framework of the very famous nexus: humanitarian assistance, development, and security and community stabilization. Because the displacement requires responses in the three areas. It's necessary. I mean, countries need to recognize that most likely people who have been displaced because of climate change will not go back to the regions where they came from. So there is a need to guarantee that they have access to protection while they are being in displacement, but at the same time, there is a need to find alternative livelihoods. And therefore, the development and this community stabilization comes to the fore. Because what we have seen in some countries is that the communities to where the displaced people go react negatively to the arrivals of newcomers. And so there is a very crucial element of diluting the tensions and guaranteeing that the settlement of the displaced people is not a source of conflict with the people of the regions where they move to. And sometimes this is very complex, and it can only be addressed if we bring in the instruments of economic development to make clear that everybody has something to gain from accommodating the newcomers with the old stayers, let's call like this. Of course, there are instruments that can be used. The NAMSEN initiative, the Sendai Framework Agreement. There are a number of piecemeal approaches to displacement due to natural disasters, due to man-made disasters that are being used by the international system. But there is no comprehensive and integrated view of mobility linked with climate change. So we are working in the COP26 framework with other UN agencies and with the different member states in having a specific stream of COP26 dedicated to impacts on mobility from climate change. And that we very much look forward to what will be the debate among the international community to address this gray zone in connection with the Paris Agreement and its implementation. On the IMRF, the International Migration Review Forum, well, we are already on the move. 2 days ago, we started with the first regional consultations. So this year, 2021, will be until March next year, the so-called regional reviews. So at regional level, member states will come together and take stock of what they have done to implement the Global Compact. What are the pros and what are the cons? Where did they achieve results? Where they did not achieve results? These regional reviews will feed into the global review that will take place in 2022 in the International Migration Review Forum. The building blocks are the regional reviews until March next year. Next 1st of December, the Secretary General will publish his first report on the implementation of the Global Compact on the 1st of December, which will be also a very important instrument to feed into the IMRF. The key issue for us in the IMRF is that it should be a cross-cutting exercise, not just a pure intergovernmental conversation, but also have the engagement of the civil society, of the academy, of the foundations and associations of different types. That's what we have tried to do in the regional reviews. And by the way, the regional review for the Asia Pacific will be in the beginning of March, if I'm not wrong. So we try to bring not just the member states, but also the civil society and last but not least, the migrants themselves. Sometimes it's difficult because the type of association of migrants is a complex one, but we would very much encourage that in these reviews, the migrants themselves take the floor. They are empowered to give their perspective and in order to have a convergence of contributions to the IMRF in 2022.
Thank you very much. We have a live question from Robert, and then there's a couple of questions in the chat. Let me just first acknowledge, because I just saw him popping up and disappearing in my screen, that we have Professor Vincent Chetai with us also in this lecture. You will continue afterwards with you today and tomorrow, but I just wanted to acknowledge his presence also, and Dr. Vitorino had mentioned him in the beginning, and I'm sure that you will have the opportunity to follow up on many of these issues with him during the lectures today and tomorrow. So Robert, please.
Thank you very much. So Professor, you just mentioned the role of the reviews and how you've tried to involve civil society, and obviously also a lot of the conversations focused on involving states in this very important discussion. I'm wondering then what involvement the private sector may have and what you anticipate might be helpful from the private sector. Thank you.
Patricia, maybe we could collect 2 or 3 questions and then I come back.
Excellent, excellent. So we have a question from the chat from Angus from Singapore, who is wondering if the Geneva Conventions have in particular Common Article 3 that relates to non-international armed conflict have a role to play or not. And I think the question that is reformulated in the second question is whether if there is no conflict, the Geneva Conventions are not applicable, and so there's less protection. I suppose that's the correct interpretation, because the Geneva Conventions are not applicable outside of armed conflict, and so one would have to follow naturally on the regimes of either the protection of refugees and the protection of migrants. So I don't know if you want to comment just in general in the IOM work, if you look at the framework of international and non-international armed conflicts, although I suspect that's more in the framework of the ICRC that is done. But I'm not sure if you look at, especially at the question of in cases of non-international armed conflict and the protection of migrants. Then there's another question by Dian from Indonesia, specifically about access to social services, healthcare, as you mentioned. What the question is, how do you think would be the best way for states to bridge human rights in normal situations and human rights of migrants, especially the irregular migrants? And this is especially in respect to access to social services in the context of human rights protection, and even in the situation of irregular migrants. So these are the questions that we have. So the one from Robert, the question of the IOM and whether the framework of armed conflict Geneva Conventions is used or relevant or not, and then this last question of the protection by human rights for irregular migrants in the context of access to healthcare.
Yes, well, on the first question, that is to a certain extent a paradox, because the private sector in a number of countries is very much engaged in migration issues as employers, and we have quite a number of interactions both with the International Labour Organization, ILO, and to business associations all over the world, and some big corporations about standards for ethical recruitment and for regulating the operation of the so-called manpower organizations. And we share with ILO a number of key principles about recruitment that, in our view, are extremely relevant to protect the integrity and the dignity of migrants. But when it comes to the global debate on migration, due to the fact that migration in a number of countries has become such a divisive issue, we always lack the voices of the private sector. The private sector is very careful in engaging in a public debate, in spite of the fact that they are the beneficiaries of migratory flows. And in a number of countries, the manpower is largely in different sectors is guaranteed by migrants. Unfortunately, some of the sectors that have been more seriously hit by the pandemic and the economic crisis associated to the pandemic. I'm talking about hospitality, I'm talking about tourism, I'm talking about home care, about domestic service, where we unfortunately register high levels of unemployment, loss of jobs, loss of livelihoods. So we would like to see the private sector more engaged in this debate. But whenever it's possible and whenever there is willingness, we have invited the private sector to participate in the regional reviews. And in the framework of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, we have a partnership with two key players. One is the International Business Organization, which is part of the GFMD. And the other one, a very key component of all this exercise, is our cooperation with the Mayors Migration Council, a council that represents a number of key cities in the world: Los Angeles, Sao Paulo, Montreal, Milan, Athens, because those cities are Freetown also. Those cities are fundamental for the reception and integration of migrants in the host societies. So from our side, I think that this multi-stakeholder approach is the more effective one, and we would very much like to encourage the private sector to be more vocal in this debate. In relation to the Geneva Convention, I'm not sure if I really understood the question, because in fact, the principles of international protection related to the Geneva Convention are not limited to the victims of armed conflicts. There are a number of other situations, not just on the basis of the Geneva Convention, but also on the basis of other international humanitarian law instruments, including the European Convention on Human Rights, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where the courts, above all, and in some cases even the legislation, have developed instruments of subsidiary protection or complementary protection or temporary protection that are not strictly limited to the existence of an armed conflict on the basis of the need for protection. IOM itself delivers protection to migrants in vulnerable situations, especially women and girls who are prone to trafficking and to gender-based violence and to sexual exploitation and abuse. So there is a more broad understanding of what is the content of protection that is based on the basic rules of the Geneva Convention, but that goes beyond the Geneva Convention of 1950 or 1951. If someone is in danger of life, of being threatened or tortured, there is the principle of non-refoulement that is applied across the border, and non-refoulement applies irrespective of the people being sent back for a conflict zone or for a non-conflict zone. It's a cross-cutting principle. In relation to the issue of access to social services, well, I do recognize it is a sensitive issue because access to social services requires public funding. And it's an issue that involves the allocation of resources. And sometimes we tend to forget that in quite a large number of countries of destination, migrants contribute more to the social protection systems than they benefit from it. And the populists like to portray the migrants as being exploiting the generosity of social services of the countries of destination. But in fact, the evidence we have is that in the vast majority of countries of destination, the migrants are net contributors to the social security system of the host countries. But of course, we do recognize that there is a need to plan for the capacity to deliver social services. And usually governments only plan according to the statistics about their own citizens, or about, at most, when it happens, of regular migrants. Because you never know exactly how many irregular migrants are present in your territory. And above all, governments usually do not like to speak about that issue because they have to recognize that one way or another, they tolerate, quote unquote, they tolerate the presence of irregular migrants. So I will not engage in a universal conversation about access to social services. I would try to focus on what are, in the short term, the key issues pertaining to the protection of human rights of migrants, irrespective of their legal status. And this involves conditions of detention, for instance. We are in favor of alternatives to detention. But if there are the situations of detention of migrants, they need to be fully respectful of their human dignity. If there are forced returns, they need to be done according to the law and with the right of defense of the people who are deported. And also when it comes to access to social services, when it comes to health services, I think that we need to ask member states to start planning how to incorporate in their national health systems the assistance and the delivery of services to migrants. And that has happened in a number of cases during the pandemic, because it has been a very difficult issue, I must say, because not just because of the difficulties of the countries to deliver the services, but also because of the reluctance of the migrants themselves to attend the public services. Because some of the migrants were suspicious that due to their irregular situation, getting into contact with the health services to be screened and treated, if that was the case, could turn into an identification of their irregular status and therefore could lead to the deportation. So there is a problem of mutual trust between the social services, the frontline services, and the migrants themselves. But we need to overcome that reluctance in order to guarantee that we are effective in the fight against the virus, as well as with the vaccine. I mean, if the planning of the vaccine does not include everybody that is present in your territory, you can vaccine your own nationals, but the virus can spread within the non-nationals. And that will fuel stigmatization and xenophobic and racist reaction. So at this point, I say it's not a crystal clear issue. It's not a simple issue. It involves the allocation of of public resources. It involves a dialogue with the society in order to prevent any backlash or negative reactions from the host society in terms of integrating the migrants in the social services of the host countries. But in the case of the pandemic, it's very clear. I mean, if no one is safe, if everybody is not safe. And if we allow people to live in the margin of the screening and testing and treatment of the virus will go on circulating in our societies. And the same can be said about the vaccine, and definitely that is our priority today.
Thank you so much. I think there's one last question in the chat. If you allow it, I will refer to it. It's from Takao Frere from French Polynesia. And the question is actually about Lebanon. Lebanon and how Lebanon is highlighting what could be considered to a worst case scenario when it comes to migrants and refugee situation between severe economic crisis, the COVID pandemic, the economic crisis, and to some extent the political situation. The question specifically is about how the IOM is dealing with this situation. So if you have any special information about the Lebanon situation and your operation in Lebanon.
Yes, well, I fully understand and agree with the description. The only point I would say is that, unfortunately, to all of us, Lebanon is not a single case. We have quite a large number, and I could give you a large list of fragile states, of countries in vulnerability, where your picture applies equally as you have applied to Lebanon. The political conflict, political instability that generates a crisis of confidence in the economy, a drop in GDP, loss of jobs, situation of people living below the level of poverty, and a large number of migrants and refugees, because in Lebanon you have quite a large number of Syrian refugees who suddenly are in a very difficult situation. So the international community, under the leadership of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, all UN agencies present in Lebanon, IOM, UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP, UNFPA, we work together in order to support not just the migrants, not just the refugees, but also the host communities. And that is a very crucial point. When we act in this kind of crisis situations, you cannot create a sort of a separate zone of protection for migrants and refugees, apart from the entire community. When the entire community, when the entire society is suffering so much. So you need to have an integrated approach and mobilize not only the humanitarian assistance, and we are delivering humanitarian assistance to the people in Lebanon. We have taken quite a large number of migrants that were stranded in Lebanon, from Sudan, from Somalia, from Ethiopia. We have taken them out and put them back in the countries of origin because they had lost their livelihoods in Lebanon. We are supporting with some of the agencies with food, some of the agencies with non-food items, that's our case, to support the situation of Lebanon. But let's be clear, without solving the problem of the political stability of the country, it will be very difficult to start rebuilding back the country. The good news is that the international community is very much attentive to what is happening in Lebanon, and so far it has been quite active in supporting the efforts of the not just the UN agencies but also the NGOs that operate in Lebanon. Let's hope for the best.
Thank you so much. So I think this last question and your answer brings us to the end of our session. Once again, on behalf of the CIL Academy and in particular on behalf of Nilofer and myself, I thank you warmly for taking the time from your very busy schedule to talk to our participants. We've had a wonderful experience in the Academy, and it's precisely with the participation of persons like you with such a long experience and also a very engaged role in these important issues. And I think migration is one of the key issues of our time, highlighted even by the pandemic, as you mentioned. We appreciate it very much your generosity in being with us and also replying to the questions of the participants. So I think we owe you a virtual applause and a big thanks for being with us today.